I look forward to seeing your comments, both, pro and con. Please feel free to, point out where you disagree with me. I'm happy to read that as well.
Read through reviews of RPGs are garbage. There are a lot of things that you can learn by just reading through the rules. You can spark some ideas. You can get a vague sense of how things are meant to run in an RPG. But until you actually play the game, you don't know what you're talking about. Despite this, I every once in a while will check out even a reading review just to get an idea of what mechanics are out there and what people's opinions are. I like to hear what other people have to say, and I like to have different ideas introduced, which might, jumpstart my own amateur game designing. However, when I looked at this particular review, it turned out to be a big mistake. So before we dive in, let me just say that I am not a fan of Critical Role. I've never watched an episode of Critical Role. I don't follow Matt Mercer or anyone else. I am not particularly excited for the release of Daggerheart as, well, first of all, I'm just not a big medieval fantasy RPG fan. So even if there's a lot of things that I might like in it, in and of itself, I'm not looking forward to the release of Daggerheart. But I'm always interested in new and interesting mechanics and why some people might not like those mechanics. So I gave this video a watch. And it was beyond counterproductive. This was an exercise in missing the point entirely. And in fact, I'm kind of shocked because while this sounds really mean, I think I mean it. I think this was a failure of reading comprehension. I have not read a single page of Daggerheart except through this video that I'm responding to. And even I can tell right away what it is trying to say. And it is kind of shocking that it's not being picked up by Unscripted and Unchained here. I think he's got a different name he wants to go by, but I'm calling him you and you because I forget.
I am Game Master Bluddworth.
When we look at some of the things that is being said on this flow of the game section, this is clearly an introductory section that's designed to tell people, hey, here's how we envision you playing this game. Here's just a brief taste.
It is it's a very important section, a very important chapter, so that you can get the proper tone for the game and understand the mechanics and all. The flow of the game section of this is something that you can completely ignore.
It's not a super specific how-to, but it's very important in the sense that it familiarizes new players on how to go about the actual process of playing the game in a more casual sense. The instruction is more casual, that is. That's particularly important for something like Daggerheart that's trying to position itself as a D&D competitor. You need to be able to talk to players who might never have played an RPG before. And even for those that have played an RPG before, you want to give them a taste, a flavor of how this RPG is intended to be played. So how is it intended to be played? Well, as the book states, again, coming straight from
Game Master Bluddworth's
video, it's set up to be more focused on story, about a conversation between player and GM, collaborative effort. This is clearly a storytelling game, or at least that's what they are aiming for.
So the flow of the game. In a session of Daggerheart, you and the other players go around the table describing what your characters do in the fictional circumstances that the GM set up, building on each other's ideas and working together to tell an exciting story.
However, instead, when
Game Master Bluddworth
reads through this, he seems to, instead of picking up this section saying, hey, here's our style of play,
Game Master Bluddworth
says, oh, you misunderstood how to play.
I have a little problem with this where it says working together to tell an exciting story. I don't know if it's just a way that they're describing it that means something different. When I first hear it, I would rather have said, they're responding to each other's players' player characters' actions or the character's actions, rather than this sounds more like they're working together to contrive, an exciting story. So that's just the one thing I don't really like about the way it's worded here.
You got RPGs wrong.
It's not role playing. All right, that just not.
Let me correct you on what you're trying to do.
There's so many problems with this.
This is exemplified very early in his video, where he says something like, I don't like how they said it, as if this is a mere difference in tone. But when you listen to what the book says,
building on each other's ideas and working together to tell an exciting story.
And what
Bluddworth
says,
they're responding to each other's player characters' actions.
They are actually saying two fundamentally different things. This is not the same idea reworded.
Game Master Bluddworth
is not reading, or rather comprehending, the text. He is not picking up what they are putting down. They are trying to say that they have a different style, and instead, like I said, he's correcting them on how to do it. In fact, at some points, it almost feels like
Game Master Bluddworth
is being stubbornly refusing to recognize what the book is trying to communicate.
This back and forth creates a collaborative conversation where everyone can meaningfully contribute to the fiction. I don't see how.
Instead,
Game Master Bluddworth
knows how to play RPGs, and Daggerheart is just getting it wrong.
This example of an interaction is just not what you should be doing. That reading of the example interaction was, and that was my first time reading it, and I just saw problems all over it.
Now here's the problem. In reality, there are multiple different styles of how to play an RPG. There is not one correct way. Now, once you determine your goal, what style you're aiming for, there might be correct and incorrect, or at least better or worse, mechanics that you could implement in order to achieve that goal. That part is fair. But if you can't recognize what an RPG is even trying to do, then you can't do that analysis. Your analysis is worthless. For example, if I picked up a Powered by the Apocalypse system that was all about, teenage drama and relationships between each other, and then complained about the bad combat mechanics or the lack of carrying capacity being detailed in there, and that there's no good procedures for generating dungeons, then that would be a pretty stupid critique. Similarly, if I go to a romantic comedy movie and complain about the lack of scares, that's probably dumb. Unfortunately, in this review, I doubt whether
Bluddworth
even recognizes that there are different styles. But before we get further into that, let's try and figure out what Bluddworth's preferred style is in the first place. Fortunately, he gives us plenty of clues to try and work that out. For instance, several times during the review, he uses the word contrived.
This sounds more like they're working together to contrive, an exciting story. I think it's best to let new players experience the game with its risks and not trying to build a story around their success, contrived success, but rather just let it happen as it happens, so much more organically.
Now, personally, I hate this word, but that has more to do with how it's used in writing advice, and that's a whole separate rant, so we'll try and put that aside. I still think it's a little odd to be used here, because he'll say things like, this is contrived success, when it doesn't seem to be the case. They still describe rolling, and rolling isn't contrived success to my mind, but I think, reading between the lines, what he's trying to say is that it comes down to how he thinks the procedure should be.
The last question is, can I clear this gap safely? All right. The answer is no. It's like, because if you roll low, then it's not going to be a safe clearing of the gap. Or do I think I can describe what the gap looks like and let the player character make that decision? Never make it, an obvious No, you cannot jump that. Describe it. Let them decide whether or not they can jump it. If it is not contributing to a fiction, the fiction is happening. The scene is unfolding based on the responses to the dice roll and the actions that they stated that they were going to do. You're just describing it. You're not having a conversation. Make them declare their actions before they actually do them. You as the game master are just setting the difficulty challenges, and then you're going to describe the outcomes based on their die rolls, and then let them respond to those outcomes with their next actions, whatever they might be.
The role has to be very specifically contextualized within the fiction first, then the role to be made. He seems to object to Daggerheart seemingly prescribing the reverse, where a role is made and then we contextualize the fiction around it to say how it happened. What to him would be a backwards process seems to be what he's calling contrived.
Everyone at the table should ask questions and integrate the answers into the game. As a player, you will often ask clarifying questions about the scene. In turn, the GM asks you questions and builds on those answers to create the fiction. How are you able to sneak around the building so carefully? Why would a GM ask that question? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. They should have described that they were attempting to sneak around the building carefully. They'll know whether they were successful or not based on if anyone discovers them sneaking around. They're not going to know how they were able to do it. They're just going to know that they attempted it, and so far it doesn't seem like anyone had heard them moving around it. You found a way to safely scramble up the wall. What made your climb easier than you anticipated? Again, that is a question that doesn't need to be asked, number one, because it's already after the fact. The players should be describing what their characters are using to scramble up the wall. I don't have them climb up and say, well, what did you do, that made that climb easier for you? It's after the fact. All right? Make them say it ahead of time. All right? This back and forth creates a collaborative conversation where everyone can meaningfully contribute to the fiction. I don't see how.
I don't think contrived is the right word, at least not how I understand the word contrived. But fair enough, as long as I know what he's saying, that's the important part. But again, our definitions of contrived and other words make it a little difficult for me to understand exactly what he means. Because, for example, he says that this is too structured to tell a story.
Again, it sounds like it's just being plotted forward too much. Yeah, and it's just too structured to tell a story rather than to allow a story to develop, allow a story to happen organically.
When I read what is presented here in the Daggerheart sourcebook, I wouldn't describe it as particularly structured, especially not in the typical RPG sense. There is no exact defined procedure of how you should do things. Rather, it's a more open back and forth, a much more loose system of doing things.
So the flow of the game. In a session of Daggerheart, you and the other players go around the table describing what your characters do in the fictional circumstances that the GM set up, building on each other's ideas and working together to tell an exciting story. The mechanics of the game help facilitate this conversation, providing structures to the discussion and a way to resolve moments when there are several exciting possibilities for what happens next. Everyone at the table should ask questions and integrate the answers into the game. As a player, you will often ask clarifying questions about the scene. Are there any guards outside the door? Or what kind of weapon are they holding? Or can I jump across the gap safely? The GM might answer these questions directly. There are 4 guards outside the door. Or they are wielding long swords. They might also ask you to roll to determine the answer. All right, it's raining and dark. So let's see how well you jump the gap. Give me an agility roll, difficulty 11. In turn, the GM asks you questions and builds on those answers to create the fiction. How are you able to sneak around the building so carefully? What does that camp you've set up look like? You found a way to safely scramble up the wall. What made your climb easier than you anticipated? This back and forth creates a collaborative conversation where everyone can meaningfully contribute to the fiction. I don't see how.
But we're getting a little bit of an inkling as to what he means, because he wants a story to happen organically, would seem. I think he's a fan of emergent storytelling. There is no prescribed 3-act structure or anything like that. Drama only happens if the roles support it and if character actions support it. If you happen to roll really well to kill the boss that just happened to come out on the battlefield, well, guess what? The boss is dead. We don't care if that's anticlimactic. That's the end of the story. If we fail our attempt to pull off a heist and the guards are after us, well, maybe this is our story now. The guards are after us. How do we escape them? And that will be however long, however dramatic, however difficult, or however easy the dice rolls say it is. Furthermore, my opinion that this is what he means is bolstered by the fact that he frequently emphasizes his own version of immersion. What does immersion mean to you?
Bluddworth.
Very specifically, that there is a strict divide between player and GM. He does not want the GM to ever get in the player character's head, and he doesn't want the player character to ever know things that their senses can't tell them.
A noble has caught Nolan's character, Lavelle, trying to steal an important letter from the bag in the busy market square at the center of town. How many guards did you say this noble had? Nolan asked Stella, the GM. True, right with him, and you suspect that there's another 2 out of uniform back in the crowd. Again, I mean, that's not something that they would, you're telling the player character what they suspect. All right, you're getting into the player character's head. You're telling the player character what he or she thinks, believes, or what suspects, whatever. It's not role playing. All right, that just not. The guards will be following you though, and once you're on the roof, they're going to draw their crossbows and start shooting. How does the character know that? This is all metagaming. This is all the GM talking as the game master and the players talking as the players, and none of it is immersive at all. There's no role-playing going on here. This is just a back and forth question and answer between the player and the game master, and the characters are not involved at all. That's more than enough to escape these guards. They're armored and trying to take shots, but none of them get close to you, and they're not good enough at jumping to risk a fall. Again, how does the player know that? By the time you're 2 blocks away, you've completely lost them, which you wouldn't know, and make sure to gain a hope for that roll. There's nothing here that tells me that you're creating a separation between player knowledge and player character knowledge. There's too much conversation going back and forth in the meta, between player and game master, and not enough putting it into the context of what the character is doing, seeing, hearing, noticing, feeling, whatever.
Metagaming is a cardinal sin for this man, and he will be very specific about what metagaming is. Immersion seems to be being almost completely in tune with your character. In some cases, this is extreme enough that the GM shouldn't even tell you what's being rolled, or rather shouldn't reveal to you the results of what's being rolled. You need to stay in the moment of the fiction.
I don't let my players roll their hide in shadows or their sneak or anything like that. I roll that for them. And then the only way they know that they were successful is if they either were, not found out, not discovered, or if they were.
Similarly, there is no assumptions about when dice can and cannot be rolled. If there's a chance of failure, roll the dice. Why? Because everything is very emergent.
Sure thing, Stella says. Based on the situation, she decides that Nolan doesn't need to roll for Lavelle to accomplish what they want to do. You're fast, and thankfully the noble is the one who spotted you, not the guards, so you can scramble up without a roll. First of all, that first climbing should have been a roll, because if there's any possibility of not being able to do something, there's a roll involved with it. That is not just hand-waved, you climbed up this massive wall.
And if you want to perform any task, you have to detail it very specifically, because every detail matters.
This past Saturday, I ran a game session, and the players had to climb a cliff face. They told me I'm going to use iron spikes, and I have 60 feet of rope, and I'm going to use a grappling hook. All right, so I'm going to use that while I'm attempting to climb. Great. And then I adjusted the difficulty challenge. And then I let them roll. They climbed up. They said, I'm going to hammer, the spikes in every several distances. It really didn't matter at that point. And they climbed up. They were successful in getting to the midpoint, which is what I described to them. And then every other subsequent player would say, well, I'm going to utilize that rope to assist myself in climbing up as well, and so on and so forth.
So in short, the style is to be very moment to moment, to control in fine detail what your character is doing, because drama could emerge from any moment. If you don't like the word drama, you could say challenge, difficulty, obstacles, threats. Those complications will not be scripted under any circumstances. Everything is to be resolved via the die rolls. The GM and the player should have a very separate roles here. And together, through this procedure, excitement may emerge. Story may emerge. To clarify a bit more on the style, it's about emphasizing player agency and immersion. If you let your players act entirely as they want, they will naturally do what most interests them, creating additional immersion. This is further reinforced by the fact that they must choose carefully their actions because there could be consequences. This grounds them in their character by ensuring that there are always stakes. Furthermore, because complications and obstacles arise from failure and player choices, players are likely to always be invested in the challenges they face, since they have an intrinsic connection to those obstacles. There is no arbitrary railroad that only the GM cares about. By repeating this process, the table will eventually stumble upon unfolding plots that arise organically and that everyone cares about. You wanted to open a bar, but when you went to buy the property, you annoyed the mayor, and he's been harassing you. Furthermore, your rogue got caught stealing from the wrong people, so now the local gang is trashing that bar. Suddenly you found yourself facing off against political sabotage, a gang war, and a fight to steal customers from the typical tavern, and all these plots start to interweave. The mayor's actually secretly working with the gang, and they're propping up the local tavern. Everyone at the table cares about this because it involves what they originally set out to do, plus the natural consequences of their actions. A story has emerged. Now, is there anything wrong with this style of play? No, of course not. It's kind of stupid to say that there is a wrong style of play in the first place. That's kind of an incoherent thought. Different people might like or dislike that style, but there is no bad style. Having said that, I have to note a couple of funny things that he says in here. For example, at some point he says that this sort of collaborative story building that Daggerheart is describing is tedious.
And that's the way that they're going to role play. That's tedious in my opinion.
I find this extremely ironic because he described a climbing challenge elsewhere in the video, and that's exactly the sort of thing that I would normally describe as tedious. However, in fairness, tedious is one of those words like boring or fun that's basically inherently subjective. So I can't really say he's using the word wrong or anything. I thought it was just really funny. For me, it's pretty hard to see how the word tedious would be applied to what's being described here for Daggerheart's system. I guess what I'm saying is I'm wondering what he meant, and I really can't figure it out. On the other hand, while I will try to understand a lot of times how people will use different words, as I think I've displayed so far in this video, there are some words that I will say you're not using right. And in this case, characterization.
I want to back off and find a place to climb up the rooftop before anyone can catch me. Sure thing, Stella says. Based on the situation, she decides that Nolan doesn't need to roll for Lavelle to accomplish what they want to do. The guards will be following you, though, and once you're on the roof, they're going to draw their crossbows and start shooting. How does the character know that? This is all metagaming. How close are the buildings? Could I leap onto the next building roof? First of all, that first climbing should have been a roll. All right. Now the person's asking, can I, how close are the buildings? All right, that's fine. Could I leap onto the next building roof? Just tell me I'm going to attempt to leap on the next building. Not, could I? Just do it. There's no role playing going on here. This is just a back and forth question and answer between the player and the game master, and the characters are not involved at all. Alright, there's no characterization going on here.
I might be getting a little too triggered by this, but as a writer with opinions, you're using the word characterization wrong. He's using the word characterization apparently to say that they're not playing in character enough. Just because they are not playing 100% in character does not mean characterization is not happening. Characterization includes actions characters make, because actions tell you about a character. This seems to be a common problem of people understanding the concept of characterization, and it drives me up the wall. For example, if the police are chasing a character, does that character fire willy-nilly back at them, caring not a whit if they die? Are they going to try and take them out non-lethally, or are they going to try to evade them entirely? That tells you something about a character. A really infamous example would come from Man of Steel, a movie I still loathe, in which, actually very RPG-like, it seems to be the case that once initiative was rolled, whoever was playing Superman seemed to forget that they were supposed to be lawful good and had no problem with endangering as many civilians as possible. Not a single action seemed to be taken by that man to protect civilians or move the fight elsewhere. Hey, it's an action scene. It's not like character is happening now. On the contrary, your actions are demonstrating a lack of care for the civilians here because there are other actions you could take to reduce the risk to them. Then, apparently after combat had ended, only then is it time for characterization again. Superman suddenly is extremely concerned that 4 people might die. Just because someone doesn't say, my rogue, knowing that this is a dangerous situation, decides to revert to what she does best and try to escape in a nimble and crafty way, using her wits and agility to resolve the situation, and instead says, can I climb up the wall and dart along the rooftops? There is an equal amount of characterization there, or at least nearly equal. After all, actions speak louder than words. So I'm sorry, in this case, I am going to be more firm and say, either you misspoke, or you fundamentally don't understand what characterization consists of. Hey, Editing Evan here, and I've just been informed by my waiter that my dish of crow is on the way. Or at least it might be. As I watched those last clips during editing, it occurred to me that I might have misunderstood Game Master Bluddworth. When I first watched the video in its entire context, I assumed that the protest, "There's no characterization happening here," applied to the entire question and answer exchange, including the bit about climbing up the wall. However, upon rewatching, I noticed the last question in the example of play was, "Can I leap the gap?" which is a question from a player to the game master and isn't an explicit description of what their character is doing. I started to worry that Bluddworth was only referring to this last and most meta of questions as not being characterization, which would render my last rant moot. Ultimately, given that his objections seemed pretty consistent across the entire example of play and he has a very strict sense of being in and out of character, I concluded it was more likely that my first reading was correct. But I can't be certain, and I think there's a plausible alternative reading. For that reason, I've included a bit more context this time to let you decide whether I'm right and my criticism applies, or if I've misread the situation and just ranted at nothing.
I want to back off and find a place to climb up the rooftop before anyone can catch me. This is just all just so wrong. In my opinion, just so wrong. It is giving conclusions to things that you haven't had your character do yet. All right. Sure thing, Stella says. Based on the situation, she decides that no one doesn't need to roll for Lavelle to accomplish what they want to do. You're fast, and thankfully the noble is the one who spotted you, not the guards, so you can scramble up without a roll. The guards will be following you, though, and once you're on the roof, they're going to draw their crossbows and start shooting. How does the character know that? This is all metagaming. This is all the GM talking as the game master and the players talking as the players, and none of it is immersive at all. All right. How close are the buildings? Could I leap onto the next building roof? All right. First of all, that first climbing should have been a roll, because if there's any possibility of not being able to do something, there's a roll involved with it. That is not just hand waved. You climbed up this massive wall. All right. Now the person's asking, can I? How close are the buildings? All right, that's fine. All right. Could I leap onto the next building roof? Just tell me I'm going to attempt to leap on the next building. Not could I? Just do it. All right. Or attempt to do it. You're not asking, can you? They should answer, I don't know. Roll. Again, there's no role playing going on here. This is just a back and forth question and answer between the player and the game master, and the characters are not involved at all. All right, there's no characterization going on here.
To give some grace, I imagine what
Bluddworth
just intended to express was once again that people weren't playing in character, and that's where he finds most of the value of RPGs to come from. However, just because that is where he gets his enjoyment from playing these games does not mean that there aren't other ways and other places to get that same enjoyment, or a different but equal enjoyment. The emergent style of role-playing isn't the only one out there, and it sure would be nice if someone could open their mind to other possibilities, even if you don't like it. For example, there are a number of games out there that I am entirely uninterested in. I referenced before the idea of a powered by the apocalypse system that's dealing with teen angst and identity. I cannot express to you the amount of my disinterest in such a system. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that if for some reason I was somehow tasked with reviewing it, I wouldn't give it my all to see whether or not it met the goals that it was set out to achieve, because those are different conversations. Nor am I going to turn around and tell the person who likes a game like that they are somehow playing RPGs wrong. For me, what I want, despite what it might have just sounded like, is I want an interactive story in the traditional sense. I would prefer to know that there is some sort of interesting drama that has been, to some degree, sculpted for me. I am currently GMing a game of Star Trek Adventures. I'm enjoying it quite a bit. However, you'll note that I break a number of traditional RPG, let's call them principles, when I run these games, and there's a reason behind every one. For example, player agency. Let's use my most recent sessions, the most recent episode, as an example. When the session starts, I don't ask my players, here's a star chart, where would you like to go? Instead, I say, you chose to come to a planet called Mari. You chose to send down an away team that included the first officer. During negotiations which you were here to make, that first officer was arrested. I do not play this out. You might even say that I take agency away from my players. In fact, I would say I take agency away from my players. No, I'm not giving you a choice as to whether or not these are the events that happened. Why? Because I've got a problem set up that I would like you to engage with and solve. In order to do that, I am not going to give you the opportunity to say, actually, I don't think we want to go to Mari. However, that doesn't mean that I've created an entirely scripted encounter. That's because I'm setting up the problem. It's up to the players to come up with the solution. Why do I do this? Why do I violate my players' agency? Because, as I said, I want to experience a story, and I want my players to experience a story. Just like in a story, there is going to be some sort of dramatic conflict. I am not going to make that dramatic conflict optional, because if I did, that would negate the purpose of my play. I am not here to play in a simulation or a sandbox. I am here to play in a story. And by story, I mean that it's going to have specific stakes. There's going to be a few steps to resolve it. Preferably, if possible, there's going to be a vague resemblance of a 3-act structure, though it's hardly guaranteed that we can achieve that. And that there's going to be character development along the way. In this particular case, the drama that I'm trying to create is an investigative drama. The first officer is accused of a crime, but we don't think that it's fair that he's accused of the crime. Can we investigate and find out, pull on these strange loose ends that have been left here to find out who the real culprit is? And actually, it's turned into more of a courtroom drama than an investigative drama, which is totally fine because that's within my player's agency and it's still dealing with the core dramatic tension. That's the experience that I'm looking for. Similarly, you'll see that I have a number of disagreements with you and you. For example, he says that there needs to be a roll anytime there's a possibility of failure. He takes exception to Daggerheart's suggestion that a character is just good enough that they don't need to make a roll. I would, in my style of play, endorse the Daggerheart suggestion. Why? Because we don't need to find out whether or not you crash-landed the shuttle or failed the transport down to the planet. We're going to assume that because the drama, the situation that we're here to resolve, is not predicated on such a mishap, even if it's technically possible. It's going to wind up being, for our purposes, a waste of time, a distraction, and an unnecessary hindrance. Furthermore, it's going to detract from the idea that we're all competent Starfleet officers. This is another stylistic difference. Not everyone is going to start out as a nobody that has to work to become a hero. That is an assumption from, I think, old school gaming or traditional D&D gaming that is not borne out in every RPG. Again, speaking to my own knowledge, Star Trek Adventures specifically calls out in its character creation section, I think that's where it is, that you as a Starfleet officer are broadly competent in many different areas. In other words, you are not starting as a cadet and playing up to a bridge officer. We're playing a bridge officer because that's the fantasy. Now again, I don't know what Daggerheart is trying to evoke, but I wouldn't be surprised if it too wanted to have characters be broadly competent from the beginning. Instead of starting off as peasants, they start off as heroes. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. But again, there's an assumption here on Bluddworth's part that when he sees that violated, that assumption not being adhered to, it bothers him, when instead what he should be doing is adjusting his assumptions. Case in point. At one point, he gets rather annoyed at the suggestion that a character would know that a guard is holding a long sword.
They're wielding long swords as an answer. Does every player character know what a longsword is? All right, you could say some kind of a bladed weapon or something along those lines, but put those things into the player character's knowledge basis, not the player's knowledge.
Now, personally, I find that to be a pretty dumb nitpick. After all, how difficult is it really to identify a longsword? I may not be a medieval weapons expert, and I know that the names of various swords can be particular, but that they have also shifted over the years, and that our modern names are not the same as the medieval names. Even so, I don't think it's a stretch to see a sword that is long and to call it a long sword. Similarly, even if they were mere peasants or beginner adventurers, it seems to me fairly reasonable that just common knowledge would let them identify a longsword. Consider an analogy. There's a lot of people in today's world who don't know much about guns. However, if someone drew a handgun, I would still expect the average person to be able to point to that and go, "That's a pistol." However, if the characters are assumed to be competent adventurers from the beginning, then this point is, well, null and void from the beginning. So his complaint seems to be overly critical here. In fact, there's a number of what I'd be tempted to call nitpicks throughout this review that I actually won't call nitpicks, because nitpicks imply that while they are small, they are still valid, and I think these are just not. It suggests to me that
Bluddworth
rather immediately developed a distaste for the system, and as a result started to find any problem whatsoever, even when they are really, really silly criticisms. Let's look at a few.
As a player, you will often ask clarifying questions about the scene. Are there any guards outside the door? Or what kind of weapon are they holding? I have a lot of problems with these questions. Asking clarifying questions like that is something that would indicate to me that the GM missed an opportunity to fully describe the room.
This is one of those absurd comments that's, well, exactly what I'm trying to point out here. A non-nitpick, because it's such a human thing. Maybe
Bluddworth
is on a level of GMing that I can only dream about. But for me, there's been plenty of times where even though I'm describing a situation or a room in as much detail as I can, that I forget something. The idea that a player, who also might have just missed something in the description, has to ask, "Hey, how many guards were there?" or "What color were they wearing?" is somehow a failure on the GM's part rather than just, a natural part of human communication, is so silly to me. It's one of those comments that makes me want to say, calm down, it's not that big of a deal. Besides, there's plenty of details that a player might want to know about that a GM didn't think was significant. I've had situations where a player will ask, "Hey, what all did the security officer have on his belt?" Because it frankly didn't occur to me to go. And when you walk into the room, you notice that there's a couple of security guards on the side. By the way, they are wearing black. It is a button-down shirt. They have a cap. They also have goggles. They've got an earpiece, which comes down. Actually, the wire goes into their shirt, but comes out near the belt where it connects into the communicator. They've got 2 weapons on the belt. One of them is lethal. One of them is non-lethal. You think, because you can't tell for certain. And also, he's got a notebook right there. And he's got military-style dress boots, also polished black. And then the player goes, but what color were his pants? At which point I go, no, I forgot to mention the color of his pants. I have failed as a GM. I'm quitting forever. How could I have done this travesty to roleplay? The fact that Daggerheart includes like a very human moment of like, hey, by the way, the players will ask you some clarifying questions. Go ahead and answer them. That's no big deal. Calm down. Similarly, there's a question in the example of play where a player asks, how many guards did the noble have? And there's this almost petulant response.
How many guards did you say this noble had? Nolan asked Stella, the GM. The GM didn't mention that. So, the answer is none.
Like, calm down. Again, the GM missed a detail there. And he could have just said, the noble approaches with a number of guards. Again, maybe you're on a different level of GMing, and when you come in, you will say, the noble comes in and there are exactly 11 guards, instead of saying like there's a squad of guards or something like that. This is just such a normal interaction at the table that you need to ease up. This is actually worse than I thought it was, because if you read the example of play here, you'll see that this question the hypothetical player asks happens right after what is effectively a last time on Daggerheart, a summary of what had happened in this fictional game session. In other words, it isn't an explicit, here's what the GM just said. So it is entirely plausible that the GM did say, hey, this noble has some guards with them. You can't say, oh, it's not in the example of play, therefore it is a fact that the GM did not mention guards. No, I'm sorry, you made that up.
A noble has caught Nolan's character, Lavelle, trying to steal an important letter from the bag in the busy market square at the center of town. How many guards did you say this noble had? Nolan asked Stella, the GM. The GM didn't mention that. So, the answer is none.
Similarly, he gets very upset that there's not, again, that exact play and character moment where the player asks how many guards does he have instead of asking how many guards did I see.
It's not how many guards did you say this noble had. How many guards did I see?
This, to me, isn't even an example of being in character or not, really. That seems like just two different ways of phrasing the exact same questions. What is out of character about how many guards does he have? If you're going to say, well, it's a question to the GM, well, so is how many guards did I see? You're still asking the real person, the GM, that is there with you IRL or over the screen. We've all, I think, had that experience where we've got a bad impression of something right away, and so we zoom into every possible, even remotely negative thing about it and go, that's bad too, and that's bad, and that's a problem. And that seems to be what's happening here. But annoyingly, some of these things that he's pointing out aren't problems at all, even by his own standards. Like, for example,
I'm by an alley, right? Why would you ask that? Tell the GM, I'm in the alley. Tell the GM where you're at. Don't ask the GM where you're at. The GM shouldn't be telling you where you're at. You're telling the GM where you're at.
Well, no, wait a minute. Even by your own standards, that's a bad idea if he's not by the alley and he doesn't have a way to get to the alley. If there's a crowd between him and the alley, then it would be wrong by your own method of play for the player to go, actually, I'm by the alley. Right? I mean, I'm not crazy here, am I? Another example of these not even a nitpicks is where he says,
Nolan tells the GM, I rolled a 17 with hope. All right, don't have to tell the GM that. The GM is looking at it. The GM sees it.
And again, this is one of those, can we have a human moment? Can we think about this for a second? I've had plenty of times where I'm GMing in person and someone across the table rolls the dice. Hey, guess what? I can't read them from where I'm sitting. How can you get mad about the book giving an example where a player says, here's the result of my roll? How unreasonable is that? I just have to say, that's not a critique. That's you gotta pull the stick out of your ass. Or for example, where a player asks, can I clear the gap safely? And he responds with,
The answer is no. It's like, because if you roll low, then it's not going to be a safe clearing of the gap.
like, you're really nitpicking the definition of safely here. I read that question a couple of different ways. To me, it is a very fair reading of the question, can I clear it safely? As in, what are the odds that I could clear this without getting hurt? It's one of those things where it's like, we don't have to nitpick every word of what someone says to understand their meaning. I know some of you think that's very rich coming from me, but I would just please ask you to note, go back to when I was nitpicking definitions, and you'll note that often I go, here's how I would use the word, here's why I don't like how he's using the word, but here's what I think he means. Let me now respond to what I think he means. If you and you were doing the same thing in this review, I would not be making this video. Instead, the words seem to have to mean what he wants them to mean. Another great example of that is there's a moment, and this one, I really do actually sympathize with him in this one. There's a moment in the describing the back and forth and clarifying questions where one of the clarifying questions, sample clarifying questions a player might have is, how many guards are outside the door?
That second question, are there any guards outside the door? How could they possibly know that? Do I hear sounds of people outside the door? That's something that, yes, you could ask. You hear motion on the other side of the door. Never like the number of guards outside the door. That just doesn't make any sense. Or even whether or not they are guards. Game Master Bluddworth,
pretty naturally, honestly, takes issue with this wording because it sounds like the player is asking how many guards are on the other side of the door. And I'm actually going to kind of side with
Bluddworth.
I think that is a bad sample question because it does sound exactly like that. How many guards are on the other side of the door? And even in Daggerheart's different style of play, that should be a pretty illegitimate question. However, I bring it up because, again, I don't think this is an unreasonable reading on U&U's part, but I want to point out that there's actually another possible reading of it. I think it's a little unnatural, which is why I'd put the blame more on Daggerheart in this case. But imagine that your player character was walking outside on a street and looks over and sees an armory. And the GM goes, there's a few guards outside the door. How many guards are outside the door of the armory? There are 2 guards outside the door of the armory. In that sentence, I think that's an accurate use of the word outside the door, or the phrase outside the door, and it's entirely in character. However, I totally understand why someone could intuit that, like, oh, we're in a dungeon or inside a building and we want to know how many guards are on the other side of the door. But I just want to point out that outside the door and the other side of the door are not necessarily synonymous. So again, it kind of goes to the point that there's a lot of things that he'll read in this review and give the least charitable interpretation to. Instead of reading the text, which I think is clearly saying, here's our style of play. Instead of reading that, what he takes away is they're failing at his style of play. And this is so crucial to understand, that there is a distinction between picking a style of play and doing that particular style of play well or poorly. And then there's another distinction about what you prefer as a style of play. Which brings us to the final problem with this video. Not only has
Bluddworth
utterly failed to recognize that Daggerheart has a different style of play from his preference, I'm not sure if he recognizes that his preference is a preference.
The players and the GMs answer questions again. You're not answering questions, you're describing what the outcomes were. It is not, contributing to a fiction. You're just describing it. You're not having a conversation. There's no role-playing going on here. It's not role-playing. All right? That just not. First of all, that first climbing should have been a roll. That is not just hand-waved, you climbed up this massive wall. This is just all just so wrong. so many problems with this. This example of an interaction is just not what you should be doing. It's not how you should be running your game. And I just saw problems all over it. So not a great lead off into gameplay. And I think that it perpetuates some pretty bad practices of role playing amongst players, especially new players.
The way he talks about it, it seems to me that he believes his preferred style of play is the correct way to play an RPG, period, in my opinion. Because he does something else that absolutely annoys me. He's not the only one to do this, but there are a lot of people that I think really need to learn the distinction between objective and subjective, because it's so annoying when I hear someone go, here's an objective statement, and I mean that subjectively. Or in other words, this is objectively bad, in my opinion.
This is just all just so wrong. In my opinion, just so wrong. This example of an interaction is just not what you should be doing. And again, in my opinion, it's not how you should be running your game. So not a great lead off into gameplay, in my opinion.
Because believe it or not, there is a way to say something, even artistically, is objectively bad. It's very simple. You just have to figure out a standard and then say, does it objectively meet that standard? And I've already talked about standards multiple times in this video. Standards are styles of play. They're what you find fun. Your game should pick a standard, pick a style, pick a goal. Then we can objectively measure, or reasonably, almost objectively measure, does it meet its goal? If your style of gameplay is emergent story and immersive role-playing, constant in-character role-playing, does this system encourage it? Yes or no? Objective answer. For Daggerheart, the objective answer is no, not really. You can then subjectively say, do I like this or not? Is this game objectively good at making drama about a teenage scenario and identity and whatever else? Yes or no? Do I like it? No. So you can separate those things, and
Bluddworth
is not doing that here, or rather, he's doing what I'm going to be mean and calling the coward's way. Now, I understand that a lot of people just don't make these distinctions the same way that I do, so it's a little unfair to call people cowards this way. And so I apologize for that, sort of, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because there are multiple statements that
Bluddworth
makes that are in actuality objective statements. This is objectively bad, and then immediately tags on the subjective thing, in my opinion. And I call it cowardly because I see it as holding up a shield. You want to make an objective statement, and I believe you do. I believe that you actually feel that this is capital W wrong, period, but then you don't stand by it. Then you back off and go, in my opinion.
This is just all just so wrong. In my opinion, just so wrong.
This is wrong. This is not how you play RPGs, in my opinion. And there's several examples of it.
This example of an interaction is just not what you should be doing. And again, in my opinion, it's not how you should be running your game.
And what's frustrating is that I almost agree with
Bluddworth.
Daggerheart is bad, objectively, at your playstyle. That's not the problem. So it's like I'm watching
Game Master Bluddworth
come out of that romantic comedy and going, this is objectively a bad horror movie, in my opinion. No, it is objectively a bad horror movie. In fact, it's such a bad horror movie that it's not a horror movie at all. It's a romantic comedy. Daggerheart is objectively bad at your preferred style of play. It's so bad at it that it's not even trying to be that. You don't have to tag on the in your opinion. You just have to listen to what the book is trying to tell you.